Welcome to episode 40 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian starting my 13th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself and my interview guests are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. Before we jump into today's topic, I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to a few listeners. Christine in California wrote, quote, "After being an English teacher for the past 12 years and now starting in the library, I feel I've entered a whole new world. I've been feeling a little overwhelmed and lost, but your episodes have given me a lot of guidance and helpful tips." End quote. Heads up, Christine, there is an episode in the works titled, "Overwhelmed? You are not alone." I'd also like to say hello to Deborah in Texas and Chantal in North Carolina and Lindsay in Thailand and Bronwyn in the People's Republic of China, who was, quote, "enjoying a mix of advice and commentary," end quote. And I think that's an incredibly apt description. I do insert a great deal of commentary in every episode, and if you've heard something which causes you to think and reflect on the job we all do, then mission accomplished. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. Season 2 began last week with advice for a first-year librarian and the rest of us. And I'd like to explain how Season 2 will be noticeably different from Season 1, and that is I will be very deliberate in interviewing experts on the topics to be addressed. Admittedly, there are areas of school librarianship for which I have very little authority or experience. I am so fortunate, however, to have found some wonderfully generous experts who not only share their knowledge, but also links to many of their presentations and resources in the show notes. This adjustment to the format comes with some obvious benefits for the listeners. The one downside I have come to realize is that I sound woefully inept compared to my guests, who all sound incredibly well informed. I will confess that I had become very comfortable being the smartest person in the room. And when you record your episodes all by yourself, that isn't difficult. However, I think I have shown considerable growth when I recognize that you, the listeners, deserve to learn from some shining examples of our profession rather than listen to the ramblings, however well-intentioned, of me. I am happy to share this platform with others if it means we can showcase the very best school librarians have to offer. I really hope no one finishes listening to these episodes and feels inadequate. Rather, quite the opposite. I hope that listeners feel empowered to make significant changes to their libraries and their programs to benefit all students and teachers. By providing an interview as well as a wealth of free resources in the show notes, listeners can take meaningful steps to make changes which will impact their collections and programs right away. And now for today's topic, advocating for LGBTQ+ and all students. I had hoped that this podcast would have an episode dedicated to addressing LGBTQ+ issues in our library, and as soon as I met JoyAnn Boudreau, I knew she would be the best person to interview. I first met JoyAnn Boudreau at ISTE 19 this summer in Philadelphia. Her presentation was titled, "Resources and Strategies to Support LGBTQ+ Students." It seemed a shame that only those lucky enough to attend ISTE 19 would be able to learn from JoyAnn and use the resources she had prepared to share with everyone. When I reached out to JoyAnn this summer, she was incredibly accommodating, and I was able to interview her one summer night. And now, here is the interview with JoyAnn Boudreau. would you go ahead and introduce yourself? How long have you been a librarian? And tell us about your journey to becoming a librarian.
Yeah, so my name is JoyAnn Boudreau, and I'm a teacher librarian in Central Indiana. And this is my 5th year as a middle school librarian and my 10th year in education. So I started out as a 7th grade English teacher. And then I knew I wanted a change after a while. I loved middle schoolers, which I actually didn't expect. I started out thinking I would teach high school forever, and that didn't happen. Taught 7th graders, loved them, wanted to stick with middle schoolers forever. But I knew I needed a shift. And so I started trying to think about what that shift was, because my heart was still very much in education. And so the more I thought about it and pondered on it all those years ago now, I just really started leaning towards being a school librarian and started looking into what are steps I need to take to get that and to become one. And it's funny now, because when I look back, after I became a school librarian, I see all these events in my life that were pointing me in that direction. You know, I worked in the basement of my college library for 3.5 years in the music department. I think I was the only non-music major in that part of the library at Ball State. And I worked at a public library for a little bit in college one summer. And I love research. And when I tell people that, some people think that's odd. So, you know, there's just all sorts of librarian traits about me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Can you tell me about your current library? Tell me about your teaching assignment, what kind of programs you run, what does your job entail?
Yeah, so I'm in a 5th through 8th grade building. We're in a big district in Fishers, Indiana. It's definitely not the largest in the state, but probably up there. And in my building, we're the biggest after the 2 high schools. We have around 1,140 kids this year, so a little over 1,000. And I'm on a mainly fixed schedule, but I try to create flexibility where I can. So we have makerspace. I try to make everything I can be able to be checked out. Sometimes I'll have a couple classes in the library, or check out carts of books to people, or pop out to classrooms when I can. So it is fixed, but I try to work around that when I can or when I need to. And then with programs, we have, I know a lot of librarians work with their state award books, and so we have that too in Indiana. So we have the Young Hoosier Book Program. We've gotten involved as a school in Global Read Aloud the last couple years, so we kind of combine that with One Book, One School and some of our buildings equity work. I always try to tie in things to Hour of Code and School Library Month and Banned Book Week. And
wow, you sound very busy. I don't know.
And then lots of random stuff in between.
Yeah, I don't know how you managed to squeeze it all in, because what struck me when I looked you up after meeting you, I should back up and explain. I went to ISTE, as did you. You were presenting, and I wanted very much to learn more about your presentation, and I used this podcast as an excuse. But when I looked you up on social media, your description was an equity fighter in training. And I've never seen that before, and I knew I wanted to have a conversation with you. So let's start from there. What does it mean when you describe yourself as an equity fighter in training?
So it's funny, because I'm a big Twitter fan. And on Twitter, you have this really, really short bio. And so I would always try to fit in all of the things that are the most important to me professionally, because that's mainly what I use my Twitter for, to connect with other educators, to connect with other librarians, to learn things. So it's mainly a connection and education tool for me. And so I had something else. I'm trying to remember what it was. I had something else in there for equity for a little while. And then when I had the opportunity to share at the ISTE Librarian Playground, my husband talked me into getting business cards. And so I made business cards. It was a good
idea. Can we agree it was a good idea?
Yeah, it came in handy.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to figure out for both like the Twitter bio and the business cards, what do I want to say about equity? Because it is very important to me, but I don't feel like an expert. I feel like very much a work in progress. And I think I'm always going to feel like a work in progress, no matter how much learning I do. I know there's going to be more I need to know and unpack. I mean, equity is definitely one of those things when you dive into it, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And so it's just continuous learning. And so then I just settled on equity fighter and training. And then it was funny because there were multiple librarians at the playground that were like saying stuff about it. And then one of them was encouraging me to start a hashtag.
Mm-hmm. I think I like that you allude to the idea that it is a process and you're not an expert. I don't know anybody who stands up and says, I'm an expert, therefore I'm going to tell you everything you need to know. But I selfishly, when I started to look into the presentation that you prepared, it seemed to me like there was so much information here. And to my listeners, this is one of those podcast episodes where you are definitely want to go to the show notes, because the show notes are just packed with all sorts of resources that will get anybody, especially a beginner like myself, a good footing when it comes to the types of resources. You've already done that for us. You've already put those materials together in a way that, especially those of us who are unfortunately, I feel like we just don't have that background. I really appreciate that. And selfishly, I'm going to be sharing all of those things, and we will work our way through some of those. So I looked at your presentation. I strongly encourage everyone to go through it page by page, because I know when you put together presentations, they're so well thought out. And the first thing I wanted to mention is the book lists, all of these wonderful book lists. Instead of going on Pinterest, instead of Googling, go to these book lists and take a look. How did you put these book lists together?
Yeah, so that's really how a lot of my LGBTQ plus work and this presentation and all of this really started, was looking for books. So I noticed a gap in my collection. And last year when I was setting goals and trying to figure out different things I wanted to accomplish that year, I was looking for some LGBTQ books. And I noticed that we had some for our more geared towards our 7th and 8th graders, because we are a 5 through 8 building, which gets a little tricky with age recommendations because you have middle grades and you have young adult readers. But we had young adult reads, but we didn't have a lot in the way of middle grade. And so I started looking into it. And when I went to my normal places to look for books and my normal methods, I wasn't finding much of anything for middle grade books with LGBTQ plus representation and characters. I mean, there were a few, but not many. And so I had to find other resources and really invest some time into where can I find these books. They have to be out there, although there are not enough of them out there, honestly. After doing a lot of digging, we still need a lot more, but it is making progress. And so really spending time on finding those books to add to my library, and then also learning more about ones for other age groups as well. I mean, selfishly, I like to read young adult lit, even for high school stuff, whether or not that applies to my building. And I also have 2 very young children. And so sometimes I guess in a way I use them as guinea pigs, because I see people tweeting about all of these awesome diverse picture books. And I was like, ooh, I'm going to check those out from the public library and read them to my own kids. And it's great because it helps me know some of the picture books that are out there. And it also exposes them to all of these great diverse voices and characters.
Well, and speaking as somebody who's been exclusively an elementary librarian, I got to tell you, that was the first thing I noticed. I was like, oh, I've read that book. I mean, you've got a wonderful list here and these fantastic resources, because even at the elementary level, these are books that I have out on my shelves, and they get checked out. They get checked out by the teachers. They get checked out by the students. And introducing ideas without necessarily announcing the idea. You know what I'm saying? So in the same way that you read to your children, when I read to my students, I'm not announcing, and here, girls and boys, is a story we're going to read about gay, lesbian, trans, children, because I want to just introduce the idea of acceptance, and that we all bring unique, wonderful qualities when we come to school. And I want my students to all feel included. And I know I've heard important discussions about how we talk about diversity versus inclusion, and to create an inclusive collection, one where everyone feels that they are welcomed. So I guess, could you maybe go into some explanation about how do you feature these titles in your collection without singling them out or sort of othering them?
Yeah, so when I was on this journey last year, that I don't want to say is over, because I'm still on this journey. I'm not done yet. But when I started this journey, one thing I also realized was, in addition to finding these books, I needed to do some personal PD work and better educate myself and read more of these titles. And one of the things I did was, there was a AASL webinar that went along with their toolkit. So they have a toolkit they came out with last year that people should definitely check out, about defending intellectual freedom. And it has to do with LGBTQ plus materials, specifically in the library. And one of the big things that was discussed on that webinar I attended last fall was about, not exactly what you're talking about not othering them. Like, if you want to have a pride display, cool, but like that shouldn't be the only time those titles are out. And really including them in normal displays, book talks, just like you would any other diverse titles, and not making it seem just other or special occasions or those types of things all of the time. And one of the suggestions that people had, people on that webinar, they were very against separating those books or stickering those books or anything noticeable like that. But people did talk about, like my school has Destiny, but whatever library system people use, you can create or add your own searchable tags and edit those. Or you can create a book list that isn't public in the sense that people can see you're looking at it, but is public in the sense that anybody can click on it and then see, oh, those are those titles that meet that. And so those are some ways to create access points for students, but without creating visible otherness. But then with exposure to students, I worked more intentionally last year on what I was including, because I had been trying to diversify my book displays and book talks, but I was really intentionally looking at who is represented and who's not, and really trying to be mindful of that. And so book displays, again, is a big, easy, important first step. What I was reading. So in addition to me reading more books that featured LGBTQ plus characters for my students' age group, I also publicly display what I'm reading in a couple places in my library and on Instagram, which I know, elementary students are likely not on Instagram, and
no,
probably,
you'd be surprised.
Hopefully not. But middle schoolers, a lot of the middle schoolers that have social media are either on Instagram or Snapchat, and I don't really want to get into Snapchat. So I have chosen Instagram and Twitter, because some of their parents are on Twitter.
Well, and I noticed in your presentation you included one, and one of the displays had a sort of poster it said "Everyone Belongs."
Yeah, that was during School Library Month.
Yeah, "Everyone Belongs" is a message that I don't think anybody can argue. I think it's a wonderful message that anybody could use in their display, and make sure and feature all of the books that you have on these lists, and hopefully invite more and more kids to read them. And you mentioned looking at these books critically to see if the students in the stories are secondary characters, if they're main characters. When you look at your LGBTQIA plus a collection, are you looking at books that truly represent an experience, or are the students in the stories, are they secondary characters, or the friend of somebody who just happens to be in the story? But I don't know. I really think that the reason why I really was excited to talk with you today is because I think so many of us feel like we don't know exactly where to start, and building our collection is the obvious first place to go. I noticed a couple of the titles on these lists that you included do have some which are frequently challenged. Have you, do you at the middle school do a banned book week? Any sort of display or recognition that it's banned book week? Because I'll be honest, at the elementary school level, I never have.
We do, but it's interesting. I've learned I have to be strategic about how I approach it, because 7th and 8th graders are there. They understand the concept. They can have those conversations. But if I try to talk to 5th graders about banned book week, it gets misinterpreted by some of them, and all of a sudden they think I'm banning books, and then shenanigans happen. So I do not approach it with 5th and 6th graders because it does not go well. But 7th and 8th graders can. And the last 2 years specifically, the banned book list, the top 10, has been very heavily targeted towards LGBTQ materials. And this past year, I believe it was right around, if not slightly over, half of the books had some sort of content or representation that they were questioning, really for those reasons. And so I had the 7th and 8th graders look at the list, and I had them, look at what these books were about and why they were banned, and just like descriptions. I asked them some questions for them to discuss at groups. And one of the questions was, whose voices are being silenced? Because when you ban books, you are silencing somebody's voices. And a lot of them, especially the 8th graders, had some very mature conversations about noticing that there were other voices being silenced, but that the LGBTQ plus community was the biggest targeted one. And why is that happening? And what does that cause? And they were having some great conversations and just taking it and running with it. And I was really pleasantly surprised that they stepped up.
Well, and the hope is by doing this, you are creating more excitement for the books in your collection, and more kids want to read books because somebody has said, by the way, you shouldn't read this book. I mean, have you noticed any of that with your circulation, that after a book has been addressed as being questioned by a community, that kids want to read it all of a sudden? I know Harry Potter has been on the list for a long time, and I've never had so much as a question. I
don't think I've seen that happen with any certain topic or group or representation specifically. I have seen that with a few books randomly in the library that have some language here and there, and then somebody will show a friend, and then the whole friend group wants to check it out. But I think that's just junior high kids being junior high kids.
No, this is very true. I like the slide that you talked about ghosting and self-censorship and soft censorship, because I'm going to guarantee you this was never addressed in library school. And that's a topic for another podcast episode. But are you aware of this happening, of things being ghosted? Not necessarily in your library, but when you mentioned it in your presentation.
Yeah, I think I've definitely
what do librarians have to be careful?
I've definitely seen some conversations happening online about it, and do we include books on these topics, and do we include this author, and we have to be really, really careful of that. We can't get our own personal viewpoints involved, and we need to rely on other resources than just our own judgment. I mean, it's just like with, I mentioned I have to be careful about age recommendations. I don't decide personally, oh, this is appropriate for middle schoolers and this isn't. That is not my area of expertise, and I would be biased in those judgments. So I depend heavily for that specifically, and because I work with some tricky age groups, there's this database called Novelist that's free through a lot of our local public libraries in this area, and they will give you, for most titles, there's exceptions, but for most titles, they'll give you multiple reviews and multiple age recommendations. So I quickly found, when I started working in a middle school library, I could find multiple age recommendations in one place, which is perfect. And so just, even if it's not a topic that you're comfortable addressing with students, or it doesn't match your religious beliefs or the other things that people talk about that make them uncomfortable, I get it. But at the same time, we have to be able to set those aside and do what is best for our kids, whether or not that makes people comfortable. And then too, K.A. Holt wrote some amazing articles that I was reading last winter when I was working on all of this about ghosting specifically, and about, some people not even necessarily, loudly censoring books or loudly objecting books, but just not including them anywhere in their classroom or in their school. So it just doesn't exist. And how, if that piece never exists, if that kid never sees a character that's like them, if they're not visible, then the kid is also going to feel invisible.
That's amazing. It's very powerful. The conversations I have with my students, and interestingly enough, I still have fifth graders in the elementary school, but this is the last year. Next year, they will be moving to the middle school, and we are reconfiguring, given some issues with closing. We have some buildings which are going to be closing. So our fifth graders are going to be moving to the middle school. Again, another conversation for another podcast episode. But the reason why I mention it is because the parents have been given a lot of assurances. Oh, don't worry, this is going to be great. The fifth graders are going to fit right in, and we're going to create these like fifth grade academies. And the librarians in the room are sort of doing the mental gymnastics, which are what happens when you bring 11-year-olds into a setting where there are many kids who are 14. And so there are issues with the collection. The conversation I have with my students, especially my students who want to be reading solid middle grade or upper middle grade books, is, what kind of conversations are you having with your parents? Similarly, the note that goes home with the families, that this is a conversation you need to have with your own children. Your children are looking for books. They are shopping for themselves. And if the parents have expectations that are important, then they need to convey those to their children, because when the children come to the library, this is their opportunity to explore and to really delve into something that interests them. And, I don't like the word gatekeeper. Librarians have been referred to as gatekeepers. And to be quite fair, with 700 students of my own, I can't possibly know what kinds of expectations your parents have. So I do put this on the students to have those conversations with their parents, because I want to be the person who hands these books over to the kids and says, enjoy them. So I did want to shift. Have you ever gotten any pushback from parents regarding your collection?
I have been pretty fortunate so far.
Knock on wood.
To not, right?
Yeah.
But that being said, I did have very open communication last year with my principal about, he knew up front this was my goal. and these were the steps I was going to take. I had a laid out plan of these are the steps I'm going to take to achieve this goal, and this is why I'm working on this goal, because the goal is more than just increasing the number of books. That was a big part of it, but it also, the goal laid out other things that we've mentioned, like me reading more and me seeking out PD and me including more in displays and all of those different layers. And so he knew this up front, and I warned him there might be pushback, and he was supportive of it. He understood it, and he was willing to take phone calls if need be. So I do not know for certain if he took any or not. I didn't. So we will see what happens as we continue progressing. But I do know that there have been some other challenges in my district. As I said, we are a large district. And, I think one thing that really helps us out a lot in our district is that we do have a librarian in each building, which really strengthens us.
Oh, because I'm so glad you said that.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of school districts in Indiana, and I know in other parts of the country as well, that only have one librarian that is serving several schools with maybe some assistance, maybe not. And so that is a concern, I know, for myself and others in Indiana. But so having a core group really helps. And two, we have a strong challenge policy that covers the whole district. So that way every building covers it the same way, which I think helps us out a lot too. So if there's a challenge, there's a specific procedure about, okay, the parent or community member, what have you, they have to fill out this form, they have to have read the book, and then it goes to a committee, and then there's rules about what people are on the committee and how many people from this type and that type and the other, and then they discuss it and review it, and then the decision goes to the superintendent, and then it goes from there. But typically speaking, they do not judge on the side of removing the book from the library, typically speaking. I'm sure there have been exceptions, but the ones I've heard about, there haven't.
When I've talked to parents who have emailed me, first of all, they've typically emailed the classroom teacher first or the principal first. I would love to be the person they email first, but in my experience, I've never been the person they email first. They go straight to the teacher or the principal. And what we've discovered typically when parents raise issues is they're not interested in banning the book, but they don't want their child reading it. And so there's a big gap between I don't want my kid to read it and let's go through this banning process. So usually using a lot of negotiation and discussing and really finding out what their objections are, it sort of goes back to this is an issue you need to discuss with your child. Because pulling this book and depriving all of our students of reading it doesn't sound like that's the solution. I do want to explore something you mentioned on your blog, Jumping with Joy, and I'll include a link in the show notes, that you do have a goal of sponsoring a GSA or Gay Straight Alliance Club in your middle school. I would love to hear how this goes, because I know quite a few high schools have GSAs. I know my sons go as allies and to be with their friends. Can you tell me a little bit about your hopes for creating this club at the middle school level?
Yeah, so the deeper I got into my collection development and programming and visibility and different things I was working on last year, the more painfully aware I became of the fact that LGBTQ plus students were not visible or seen. They were not seen in my building, and they could not see themselves in many things. And there are people that would argue, well, some of them are only 10, or, well, they're only in middle school. And I'm like, no. But they're going to be between 10 and 14 while they are with us in this building. They're going to hit puberty while they are in this building. So even if they walk in the door not knowing everything about their identity yet, they're gonna figure things out while they're here. And it's important that we're there for them. And so there had been talk a while back, I think, but before I got involved with it, about starting a GSA, and it fell through. But now we have 2 strong high school GSA programs that I believe have been around for a while. And one of the junior highs started a GSA 2 years ago, and one of the junior highs started a GSA last year. And so our district is mainly split up for junior highs to be 7-8 and intermediates to be 5-6. I am the only exception in the district. We are the only 5-8, which sometimes puts us in great situations and sometimes makes things tricky. And so, we had to have some tough conversations about 5th and 6th graders, and there were some disagreements about whether or not they could be invited to join. But ultimately, we settled on that 5th and 6th graders could join if they had parent permission, but they need parent permission for other clubs too. So, all right. But so now almost all the junior highs in our area have them. Our call out meeting is actually in 1 week from when we're talking. So it's next Wednesday. And a math teacher is going to be helping me out, which I'm super excited about, having somebody to bounce ideas off of and kind of work through this process. And, he had a couple students in his classroom that kind of moved him to becoming involved in this work. So I'm really excited for us to work together. And the more I read about GSAs and the more I talk to other GSA leaders in my area, there's a lot of different avenues that the club can take. Some of them have guest speakers a lot. Some of them work on advocacy, self-education, just supporting each other and talking about things. And so I really want to, my hope is that students that come will have an opinion on what direction they want us to go in. And I want to help them brainstorm ideas and see possibilities, but I really want them to decide what type of GSA do you want this to be or need this to be. And maybe that will vary from year to year, and that's okay. But what is our focus going to be this year? And really kind of trying to just kind of get to know each other and figure out what we want to do in the beginning, and then take it from there. So we're going to figure it out as we go.
I read something on another website, which we'll be linking in the show notes, and that is with the EduPrideAlliance, which you're affiliated with. And one of the quotes mentioned on that webpage mentioned about our students surviving in spite of us, and not because we were a support. Getting through school, be it elementary, middle school, or high school, in spite of the fact that they weren't seen, they were not visible, they could not see themselves in their collection, they did not have teacher support or allies who gave them the kind of encouragement that kids need, especially in middle school. It's just brutal. It doesn't matter who you are. I love the fact that you're in a middle school, because I know there are a lot of folks who think back on our own middle school experiences, and there's a lot of mixed feelings. But the fact is, these kids require the same kind of love and support that all kids get. And unfortunately, if they don't receive it, the struggle becomes that much harder as they go through puberty, as you said, right there in front of you. And supporting them is fantastic. Let's segue to this organization that you are a founding member of, the EduPrideAlliance. Another resource which I'm going to include in the show notes. Could you tell us, I know we're in its inaugural year, could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration and moving forward, where you'd like to go with this group?
Yeah, so we got started at ISTE. So we are a whole right around 2 months old. But we are a very eager group with a lot of heart and enthusiasm. So there was the Sunday of ISTE, there was an ISTE Equity in Action Forum where educators that were interested could apply ahead of time to be a part of this. And they sent out an email, I think, to everyone that had registered to ISTE a couple weeks or months ahead of time. And all you really knew going into it was they wanted people invested in equity. They were going to put people into groups, and these groups were going to commit to working together to address some sort of big equity issue. But that's really all you knew going into it. And so then you show up Sunday morning and you get together with a table, and the table starts brainstorming ideas and talking about different things. And Ginny McGeera led it and organized it, along with a lot of other facilitators and folks helping out. And then after a bunch of lead-up steps that were important and very well executed, I was impressed with how they ran that. But then you had to ultimately choose between all of these big topics around the room and stand by the one that you wanted to commit to. And so with the projects and everything I'd worked on last year, and then knowing that I was going to start a GSA this year, I went to the LGBTQ poster, and that was all it said. It was very vague. It was just LGBTQ. And I went there, and there I met our other founding members, Nancy Jo Lambert, Matt Hamilton, Jean Williams, Kelly Roberts, and our facilitator, Sabia Prescott. So Sabia was one of the folks that helped Ginny McGeera get things set up. And so she is supposed to help kind of guide us and keep us on track. But Sabia also does a lot more than that and definitely has a hand in the work along with us. So we are just eager to get things started. So we have recently started a Twitter and an Instagram and a website and a logo, and just trying to get ourselves.
That's a lot in 2 months. I mean, that's a lot in 2 months, especially because you're working remotely. You come from all different corners of the United States, and you're working remotely. So that takes a collaborative effort there.
Yes. So we've had 2 in-person meetings, and then multiple virtual phone calls, and then lots of Twitter DM messages. And we're good at kind of splitting up the workload and kind of learning. We seem to have quickly learned what some of each other's strengths are, and so kind of playing to that and splitting up the workload a bit. But
cool. Could we make sure, then we'll include that when we talk about your social media contacts at the end. We'll include those social media contacts as well, because I've seen them on Twitter all over the place. So I know that it's a very active group on Twitter.
Yes.
No conversation would be complete without mentioning Pride. And I know that you're not in school during the month of June. You're in school right now, and so I know it's a school night. With June being Pride Month, do you feel your school will do, or your library will have any sort of celebratory displays or any sort of activities that you might like to showcase? Especially your group at that point might have some ideas of their own of what they would like to do for Pride Month.
Yeah, so we aren't in school that month, but I definitely want to have conversations with the GSA towards the end of the year to see, whether it's something we want to do just in our closed group, like kind of a end of the year celebration / hey, it's almost Pride Month, and just kind of combine it into a party. Because I usually, whatever clubs I run, there's some sort of end of the year party anyway. So maybe it could just be bigger and better. But also I definitely want to, with whether it's Pride Month or Ally Week or Day of Silence, I definitely want to work on paying attention to, there's a great calendar of events on GLSEN's website, and I really want to work on paying attention to those and just seeing like what the club wants to be involved with or not involved with, what they're interested in, and maybe they are interested in all of them. Maybe they want to pick a couple and work on promoting them to other people in the building. But definitely a topic that I want to address with them.
That's great. I'll make sure to include a link in the show notes to the GLSEN calendar of events. I'll also try and get the ALA archive of the webinar that you were able to participate in last year. Tell us where you are on social media, because I really enjoyed a lot of your posts. You're always pointing directions to fantastic resources and wonderful ideas. So could you give us an idea of where we can find you and your organizations on social media?
Yeah, so I am most active on Twitter, and I'm there at Mrs. Boudreau, which is a whole lot of vowels, Boudreau. And then my library also has a Twitter and Instagram at HIJH Panther Lib, and Lib is just short for library, LIB. And then EduPrideAlliance has started a Twitter at EduPrideAlliance, and we also have started a hashtag Teach Pride. But there are also a lot of, which I mean, you should definitely follow them and join us in our work. But there are also a lot of people that I've learned from on Twitter. I am probably on Twitter too much, but I do some of my best learning there and find some of my best equity resources there. And so it kind of started with We Need Diverse Books. And then I discovered Own Voices. And then that led me to Disrupt Texts. And that led me to Clear the Air. And there's just so many great groups out there. And to all of those hashtags all have amazing founders and co-founders that I also follow and learn so much from. And also, going back to EduPrideAlliance for a minute, I know that we are still actively looking to build our community, and not just our community, but also our leadership team, because we really want to expand and diversify our leadership team. We're a small but mighty group right now, but we really want to be intentional about having more diversity in our leadership and expanding to have more people of color and more LGBTQ plus identities than the ones that we already have, or maybe more of those, or whatever. We just are really looking to have more people join us in this work, whether it's in a leadership role or a participant role, because we know that when that happens, we will be able to improve upon the ideas that we already have and really be able to take on a powerful direction with other people involved.
Can I ask, I know on the website there was a Google form that people could fill out. Is there a window, how long that will stay open? Or
so we have not set any close window on that yet. And I know that we are starting to look at the responses that we have gathered so far, because we want to make sure to get back to people that have responded. But there is not a window on that right now. So if you are interested in a leadership role or being a part of planning and those conversations, definitely consider filling that out on EduPrideAlliance.org. Or if you just want to be a part of the conversation or a participant, that is also cool. And that is where you can find us on the hashtag. And we have a book study coming up on September 4th as part 1. We are working on reading One Teacher in 10, the newest edition of that book, because there have been a few. And we are going to talk about part 1 on September 4th.
Well, I'll tell you what, this podcast will come out probably... let's see, I want to say the first week in September, just because I think the resources need to be shared with teachers early in the school year. I think that it's really important to have this conversation now when we have the whole year ahead of us, so that many of us can incorporate these books into our budgets, and we can start thinking about how we can support our students and create a more inclusive collection so that everyone feels welcome. So I really want to thank you for taking time out of your busy evening. I know you're in school, and I really have to thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
It is no secret that I love using podcasts to learn, so I wanted to be sure I included several podcast episodes which I found thoroughly engaging and helpful on the topic of LGBTQ literature, and I've included links to all of them in the show notes. First is a pair of episodes from KidLit Women, which is hosted by Grace Lynn. In the first episode, K.A. Holt reads her essay, Now You Seed Me, Now You Don't. The second episode is a follow-up conversation K.A. Holt has with Grace Lynn. I also wanted to make sure I included this quote from the interview that Grace Lynn had with K.A. Holt, because I really think it identifies one of the biggest concerns individuals might have about incorporating LGBTQ plus books into their collection. And this is from K.A. Holt. She says, quote, I'm going to say this slowly and loudly. Just because it is labeled as a queer book doesn't mean it's about sex. LGBTQ does not mean sex in a book. It just means that there are characters that are identified that way. Period. End quote. Scholastic Reads also has an episode which posted this past June, and I will quote the description on the podcast episode. Quote, It's Pride Month. We love to celebrate our LGBTQIA authors all year long, but we wanted to take a special opportunity now to shine a spotlight on what it means to create and share stories about those who are marginalized and underrepresented. Today, you'll hear from Mason Deaver, Kaysen Callender, and Bill Konigsberg. Each will introduce their latest novels, talk about their creative process, and discuss what it means to write books that are giving some young readers a chance to see themselves represented in the pages of a book. End quote. And finally, I would like to include a link to KidLit These Days with Matthew Winner and Karina Jan Glazer, who posted an episode in June for Pride Month. Quote, Karina and Matthew will talk about LGBTQ representation in children's literature, anti-queerness, and parallels with colorism and racism, and what LGBTQ-centered stories can mean for kids who have not yet encountered queer individuals. End quote. I would like to extend a very special thank you to JoyAnn Boudreau and to everyone whose resources made recording this episode so meaningful to the listeners. I would also like to thank you, the listeners, for joining us today. If you found this podcast useful, consider sharing it with your fellow school librarians and your PLN. Our next episode will be using social media to showcase your program, including an interview with Amanda Jones, which will be posted on September 15th. I hope you will tune in.